Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and check it out. I've got a package I'll be unboxing for you. This came from Canada, and it's very exciting. If you saw the title of the video, of course. Now, this actually specifically comes from a little company called HD RGB Consoles. Now, I've worked with them in the past, Patrick and John. I've actually met them. They're really nice guys. I'll put a link in the description to their information, their Instagram, their YouTube, their eBay page, as well as their actual store. They have a store now in Southern Ontario. I guess it's open on weekends, but it's pretty cool. The idea being that you can take consoles in there and have them modified as a service, or you can buy pre-modified consoles. So these guys know what they're doing. In the past, they hooked me up with an RGB N64, which was fantastic. You can check out that video, as well as a VGA modified Sega Dreamcast, which was also fantastic. So like I said, these dudes know what's up. And I was just talking to them about this particular concept, the HDMI GameCube, and they basically said like, yeah, we can make one, and they hooked me up with one. So full disclosure, they sent this to me absolutely for free for the purposes of review, which was really nice of them to do, because part of the issue that we had just been talking about was the fact that even though this mod has been out there for a while, there's actually not a whole lot of videos about it, just because not too many people have had access to this yet. And so I thought that would be awesome to do a video on, and they totally agreed. So seriously, thank you to Patrick and John. Please check out their information in the description. They do really quality work. And as for like pricing and stuff, contact them about all that kind of stuff. But remember, they are in Canada. So if you're in Canada especially, that's really gonna work out for you. Obviously, they'll work with Americans. I am one. And if you live in like Australia or Europe, I mean, you can. That might get expensive, but you know, they'll certainly work with you. Anyway, so let's move on and let's actually open this thing up and take a look at the content, shall we? So very excited. I'm really excited about this, man. Like, this is something you guys know. Obviously I really like the GameCube, and I've talked about it a lot in the past. So to have one with an HDMI mod, man, that's something sweet. Because everything I've heard about this thing going into it, it's pretty awesome. So opening it up, we've got, well, the GameCube itself right here. And he said there was going to be something else inside, right there, as well as, the hell? Okay, I really wasn't expecting this. That's pretty cool. So first, this little thing, he hooked me up with, I believe this is their business cards. So you can take a look at that if you want. Real quick here, we got, yeah, HD RGB consoles, card by Patrick. There's a couple of Patrick's cards right there, as well as, I'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, so this is also a note attached that says gift. I saw you picked up some Famicom games, so here's a random NES clone from Japan. Enjoy, best Patrick. That's pretty funny. So yeah, I wasn't expecting this at all. He threw in a random Famiclone console. That's really weird. Well, thank you very much for doing that, Patrick. That's awesome. So there you go, random Famiclone. I can't say I was expecting that. But the other big thing that he obviously included was the GameCube. So let's open it up and take a look at it. Right here, get through the bubble wrap. Ooh, nice. Okay. There it is. It's a black one, obviously. Now he gave me two choices. He said, do you want black or silver? So I picked black. I've always kind of preferred black consoles over silver consoles. Now, as you can see, it looks stock. There's not really any obvious changes to it until you get to the back. Now, in this case, there is a switch on this, which we'll talk about. This switch is apparently not mandatory. We'll talk about it in the review part. But then there's the real meat and potatoes of this, the HDMI port, which is pretty nicely locked in there. But again, we'll talk about all that kind of stuff when we get into the full review mode. But for now, I want to give you a little bit of history of why this even matters, what's the deal, why does this exist? So here's the thing. If you guys have been following me for a long time, you know I talk a lot about video quality out of our game consoles. And the GameCube has always been kind of an oddball because it's such a great game console, but it has always been kind of hindered by its options when it comes to the best video quality. Now, a couple years ago, I actually did a video on that particular subject. It was something like 25 minutes long, because it's me. But basically, I broke down all of your choices. And when it comes to the GameCube, you have a few options. I'm going to summarize them real quickly here. The best option that existed natively is component cables. But the problem with the component cables was twofold. One, they only got a wide release in Japan and a small release in North America, and were never released in Europe and never released in Australia. But But on top of that, they're stupid expensive. Like stupid expensive. Like $300 is kind of the going rate for those cables now. And obviously most people don't want to do that. So what a lot of people do is look for the alternatives. Some people say, hey, I want to get a Nintendo Wii and use the GameCube component cables for that. You can, that is obviously a cheaper option, but the reality is a GameCube running with component cables will output a better video quality signal than a Wii with component cables. So they're not as good. Then people will say like, well, maybe I'll use like RGB SCART. Problem with that is that only worked in Europe. Europe got a really weird deal with the GameCube. They not only did not get the component cables, but the PAL versions of their games intentionally went out of their way to disable the high resolution modes. Let me explain this real quick. If you were in North America and you bought Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, that game had in it code for a progressive scan, essentially high definition mode, which is 480p, and back in that day that would be high definition or a higher definition. That also worked in the Japanese version of the game. However, the European version of the game, Nintendo went in and intentionally stripped that out of that game and every other game. I, to this day, don't know why Nintendo did that, but let me make this incredibly clear to everyone in Australia and in all European nations. There is absolutely no way you can play the PAL version of a GameCube game with native progressive scan. It isn't possible. You can't do it with any combination of cables on a GameCube. You can't do it with any modification to a GameCube. You can't do it on a Wii. You can't do it on a Wii U. The only way you can do it is if you were to buy or import or pirate, whatever, North American and Japanese versions of GameCube games. PAL copies simply will not work. They don't have the code in them. That's just the reality. It sucks, I agree, but that's how it is. To compensate you, what Nintendo apparently did was gave PAL versions of GameCubes RGB SCART support. That was stripped out of North American and Japanese GameCubes. Now that wouldn't matter so much to us because we don't even have RGB SCART over here. The problem is because those GameCube component cables are so expensive, we practically can't use them. So we had to look for our next best option, which was not RGB. You guys in Europe and Australia had the second best choice. We had third. We had S-Video as in the next choice, but most people never did it. So the reality is most people playing GameCube were just playing with composite cables for all these years, and composite sucks. It's disgusting, and I'll show you guys some comparison footage later. So now in 2017, people are like, I really don't want my GameCube to look so bad anymore. It's such a great game console. I want it to look good, but I really don't want to spend the money. What are the other choices? Well, now you have a couple others. One is there's now an HDMI adapter that exists. Now I've used this briefly. I've seen it in person. I don't own one, so I can't give you any sort of like review of it or any great knowledge about it, but it has been plagued with a couple of hardware issues, but apparently that's been revised. I don't know what other additional benefits exist in it other than the obvious that it's convenient to be able to use on any GameCube. This, however, is a little different because it's an onboard modification. The GameCube has been opened and a board has been soldered into it. And that allows for additional benefits that the native GameCube could not have. The obvious issue with that is that it's limited to just this GameCube. It doesn't allow you to work on multiple GameCubes. But again, we'll go over that in the review. But ultimately, the point here is to have a GameCube with the best possible video quality. Now you might be asking, well, dude, I have the component cables already. What is the point of this? I only recently came to understand this. There's two benefits to this. One I understood, which is we're going to a point now where component is being very phased out. It never was that popular to begin with, but it's becoming much and much less common on modern televisions and monitors. But HDMI is obviously here to stay, at least for a foreseeable future. This future-proofs the console so you can use it longer into the future and with good video quality. But the thing I didn't know, the second part of that, is that when it comes to the GameCube, it had internally a digital, very clean signal. And that's what the component cables are meant to tap into, and they do. The problem is they have to downgrade from digital out of the console back to analog and then up to digital again when it hits your TV. So there's like a wave there. That wave, if you want to think of it that way, creates additional noise in the video signal that does not exist in this. This is a pure, straight digital image. Therefore, this is, presumably, I haven't used it yet, the single best way to play the GameCube. Is that true? Let's find out right now. Okay guys, I've been using this for a while and I gotta say the short version of my review here is this thing is fantastic. I love it. It has definitely met almost all my expectations and in certain ways massively exceeded them. So that's what we're gonna talk about now. But before we do that though, before we jump straight into the meat and potatoes, which is of course the HDMI board portion, I do want to address a couple other things that are not related to that John and Patrick happen to include in this, and it would explain why we have another GameCube sitting here. So I've also attached the Game Boy player. Yes, obviously it works with the Game Boy player and it looks damn good. You guys will see all the comparisons towards the end of the video. But the back of the GameCube, right? They made a few different changes, some of which are obvious and some are not. Now obviously HDMI port, that's great. Second is this switch. Now the switch here is funny because the switch kind of has no point, but let me explain what it does. If you have it the way it is currently set, at least on mine, it's in what is called American mode, and the LED on the console will be blue. If you flip it to the other direction, it's in Japanese mode, and that will cause the LED to be red. Now, basically what's happening there is that switch is going between American BIOS and Japanese BIOS, and it's also changing the color of the LED. That sounds like it's a good idea. It sounds like it makes sense because the logic there would be, okay, if it's in American mode, it'll play the American games. If it's in Japanese mode, it'll play the Japanese games. While technically accurate, it is essentially superfluous because the next mod they put in was actually the Xeno chip. Now the Xeno chip is a mod chip for the GameCube that does two things. The first is that it makes the console completely region free. It makes it play American, Japanese, and even European PAL games. On top of that, it also allows you to play burned games, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that's funny though, because basically if you have it in Japanese mode, it'll play Japanese, American, and European games. If you have it in American mode, it'll play Japanese, American, and European games. So it really doesn't matter which mode it's in, unless you just care about, you know, seeing it in English or seeing it in Japanese, and if you like the color blue or red more. Like, that's really all it does. It doesn't have any real point beyond that. But it's just kind of cool they included it. Now, as I mentioned there, this thing plays burned games. Now, that has never been a feature that's particularly interesting to me, at least not in a long time, but I can see why that would be useful, especially to people in Europe, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now to illustrate that point, they actually included a copy of Ikaruga. This is a burned DVD mini of Ikaruga for the GameCube, the North American version. So it works on this GameCube, no problem. But I also have this GameCube here. This is actually a PAL GameCube that was modified by my friend Raymond in the UK. And what he did is he actually included this custom case. Now, you might be wondering what the hell the point of that is, but there is a very significant point to that. The GameCube, obviously, part of what the whole design about it was that they didn't want it to play full-size discs because they thought that would help prevent piracy, and to an extent, for a time anyway, they were right. But now that's annoying because if you do want to do stuff like that, you can't get a full-size disc in this console. That was the whole point. But there is actually enough space for it, you just have to have a different case. Enter this. Because of the Viper case, you can actually fit a full-size DVD-R in here. Now you're still limited to one game per disc, even though the discs hold more data than the GameCube discs do. You essentially just burn one to the disc and it'll work. So if I were to, for example, take this and put it on here, it would work with that, and that's nice. So if you think about pirating stuff with the GameCube, theoretically, this case on here is the ultimate way to do that. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Again, I'm aiming this more towards Europeans because there is a logistical reason for you guys to care about it, which we'll talk about in a bit. So, that all out of the way, let's talk about what we're really here to talk about, which is the HDMI output of this console. Now, I gotta say, the first thing that caught my attention with this was leading up to it, I was always concerned whether or not, frankly, it would work. Like, I didn't expect it to be junk, I didn't expect it to be a dud, but what did concern me is that basically half the GameCube games only support 480i. Now, 480i is not really a big deal when you're using Composite, S-Video, SCART, or even Component, because televisions and monitors that use that are expecting 480i. Frankly, a lot of TVs, though, that use HDMI, the HDMI port doesn't support 480i because it's not a resolution that usually goes through there. In other words, what I'm saying is I wasn't expecting my TV to understand the GameCube. I've had previous experience with this with like the PS2 to HDMI adapter. Granted, that was like a Chinese piece of junk. It's a little bit different, but still, the point is that thing took the PS2's 480i signal and just passed it through. and my television could not understand it. Some monitors could, my recording software I think at the time could, but my television couldn't. So I was worried that this was going to be the same situation and that only the 480p compatible games were going to work. Aha, that was not the situation. The chip in this thing is smarter than that, and damn, that's awesome. Because basically, the chip on board looks and detects what resolution the game is, or whatever the display is, I should say. And if it's 480i, it goes, okay, let me just go ahead and deinterlace that, and it creates an artificial 480p signal. Therefore, the television is going to understand it, which is awesome. Now, the thing about that you have to understand is that that's not a true 480p signal. It's essentially just the chip kind of doubling the image so that your TV will understand it. It still looks better than the component output natively on the console when it's 480i, but it's not going to blow you away. And unfortunately, in the case of all Europeans, that's what you're going to be dealing with. But to those of us in North America, especially with the progressive scan compatible games, you're really going to see the benefits, because any game that actually has the 480p compatibility in it, that's when this thing shines. And it looks so good. Again, I'll be showing you all that towards the end of the video. Now, more about the chip itself. It has a little interface menu on it. If you hold L, R, X, Y, and Z all at the same time, a little blue screen will pop up, and it has various options in it. For the most part, I never felt the need to tinker with this. I was looking around, and there's not much in there that I needed to change. At least the way John and Patrick delivered it to me, everything was kind of set the way I would have wanted it anyway. You want to make sure that 480p mode is enabled. You want to make sure that deinterlacing is enabled. That way the 480i games will work on your HDMI inputs, as mentioned before. The only one that might potentially be screwed up there is there's an option that says something about DVI. Having this in the wrong setting will disable the audio of the GameCube, so just make sure it's in the one that audio is supported. But if you buy it from John and Patrick, I'm imagining you won't run into this issue because they'll probably configure it for you, is my guess, because they did that for me. But beyond that, you don't really need to do much in there. There are some adjustments for, like, really, if you want to tinker with like the exact color specs and sound settings and stuff like that, you can do that in there as well. I didn't really mess with any of that stuff, but it is there. So yeah, beyond that, I just want to talk about a couple of other things I noticed. Now this thing ran everything I threw at it. I put in games that I knew would not support 480p, things like Resident Evil, and it ran great. It looked better than it ever has. That said, there is one strange quirk about this thing that I don't like, which is that it started out as a nicety, but got rather annoying. When you're using this, you'll notice in the upper right corner, it will display whatever resolution it's kind of detecting and running things at. That's nice at first, because you're like, okay, it's working, I see that everything's the way it's supposed to be. The problem is a lot of GameCube games switch their resolution on the fly, and that thing persistently will just show up and remind you every time something changes. And that can actually be really distracting, so I wish there was a way to turn that off after like the initial boot or something like that. As far as I can tell, there is nothing like that in the current firmware, and it is annoying. But I noticed in the progressive scan compatible games, this was less of an issue because they typically hold more consistently at 480p. So once you see it that first time, it usually goes away. The 480i games are kind of a crapshoot. Now there are games that run at lower resolutions, things like 240p. This will actually compensate for that, and it will run them at different resolutions, again, to make sure that they work on your television, which is really nice. But that's where we get into the other oddity of this. Now this is something that John and Patrick didn't even know their console was capable of. I decided to throw some PAL games at it. This is where we got to talk about the PAL stuff, because this stuff is a quirk, and my heart goes out to anybody in Europe with a GameCube a fetish. Anybody who likes the GameCube in Europe, I'm sorry, because Nintendo really screwed you guys. So the thing is, in North America, this doesn't matter much because, as I keep saying, we had the progressive scan games, and we got most of Nintendo's best stuff, and a lot of stuff we couldn't get, we can get to Japan. And as you notice with that Switch, it's inherently easy to go between Japan and North America with the GameCube. It's not hard. It was European stuff that was weird. And there's never been that much demand to try and fix it because all their stuff had the progressive scan stuff stripped out of it, and on top of that, there's really not much in the way of worthwhile exclusive content. Off the top of my head, I think there's only something like six GameCube games released in Europe that North America never got. Now I own two of them, Doshin the Giant and like Kokoto Platform Jumper. Those are the only two I have. And I wanted to see if they would work. Now here's the thing, the Xeno chip, because of the Xeno chip, they do work. The console will detect them, it will run them. However, my television would not. I was very disappointed in that I thought that the chip on board was going to recognize what was going on, that it was inside of an NTSC console, and that it was going to say, okay, this is a PAL game, let me deinterlace or convert, whatever the fuck you want to refer to it as in this case, try and output it from a PAL to NTSC signal so that it would work. It does not do that. So it will output a signal, and it will actually change the resolution of that signal. It changes it, I'm not as familiar with PAL resolutions, but I believe it changes it from 576i to 576p. And in doing so, some monitors will understand it, and my capturing software understood it. My capturing hardware and software understood it, but my primary television did not, which was unfortunate. However, the odds of me needing to play those two games in particular wasn't that high. But because I just wanted to be thorough and test everything, I decided what I would do is connect it to the FrameMeister and see what kind of results I would get. So I took this GameCube with the HDMI output, running one of the PAL games, stuck it into the HDMI input of the FrameMeister, and it worked, as I expected it to, because the FrameMeister did what I was just describing by essentially adjusting the resolution and compensating so I could see it, or my TV could understand it. And it didn't look very good. And I was like, that's really weird. And then I tried, just as an experiment, I tried the exact same thing. As I told you, this thing supports dual output. You can do both at the same time. So I basically just fired over to the component version through, again, the FrameMeister. And it not only did it work, but it actually looked really good. It looked a hell of a lot better than the HDMI output. So what I'm telling you is, this is not an issue with the GameCube, it's more of an issue with the FrameMeister. If you have this thing, if you're in the incredibly niche market of people in North America who have this GameCube or an HDMI GameCube, who want to play one of the 6 PAL exclusives for the GameCube, and you have a FrameMeister, connect it through component, not HDMI. There you go. To all 2 of you in the entire world, I'm probably the 50% of those 2. That's how you do it. But I just thought that would be interesting and thorough. Now, in case you're curious, like, well, wait a minute, does that mean the component is better somehow? No. In general, when you take any of the NTSC games, meaning the Japanese or the North American stuff, and you connect if you do a straight component output of this thing to your TV versus a straight HDMI output of this thing to your TV, the HDMI wins 100% of the time. So it is absolutely beautiful, and I can't recommend it enough for people in North America. Now, here's where we get into the interesting situation with Europeans, though. You guys, as I mentioned earlier, got really screwed on the GameCube and, when it comes to not only your games getting that stuff stripped out of it, but all that shit. Now, here's the thing. If you are in Europe and you want to take advantage of this console, you're gonna have to get North American games, but as I usually would, say, like, just go ahead and buy them, and that's just impractical and illogical in this case. So what I might actually suggest to Europeans, this one time only, you get this GameCube, you put this case on it, and you simply burn the North American versions of your favorite games, and you'll really see the benefit of it. Still buy your PAL games and all that stuff, but really, you're probably, once you have this and you actually play them, the progressive scan North American versions, you'll never go back, because it's substantially better looking. And I'm sorry you guys got fucked. I mean, it was really Nintendo's fault, so you can't even feel that guilty about it, to be honest with you. Again, I don't usually condone piracy, but in this case, they fucked you, so fuck them back, I guess.
Okay guys, it's time to do some comparison footage here. Now for your convenience, in the upper left corner you can see what we're recording via. The first one, Composite, now obviously S-Video, you get the idea. Now this one's a little bit more unique because I included more options than usual, and you're going to see what they are. Also worth noting, RGB SCART is the only one that was not recorded off of the modded GameCube because it's a NTSC GameCube, so it actually can't do RGB, as mentioned before, so I just kind of have a stunt GameCube in for that. Now this component 480i is worth noting because that's the best PAL games can ever look. If you were to, common misconception, you can buy the component cables and ship them to Europe and they will work on a European GameCube. It's just that they don't support the progressive scan modes. So if you were to mod it with the HDMI mod, the HDMI 480i output is the best PAL games would look, whereas the HDMI 480p is the best that the North American games and Japanese Japanese games will look. Same, of course, component 480p is what our games look like. So it gives you a sense of it, and I know this stuff's kind of rushing by here, but you'll get, you know, it'll come back around. You'll see more stuff. But yeah, so this is, of course, Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 was a launch title for the GameCube. Very good game. But component 480i, again, this is the best PAL games can look under optimal situation. And these are the best. This is what it looks like natively with in North America with the correct cables. Of course, now the whole point is to use the mod there. So this is what the game can look like in a game that does not support the 480p progressive scan modes. And of course, if it does, you'll see right there that it even says as such. It can detect that it's in 480p in the upper right corner. The games can look like this, a giant black screen. No, unfortunately, that was just a bad clip that came up there. But trust me, you'll see more of it towards the end of it. But yeah, so you can see what I meant by it being a little irritating that constantly comes up in the upper right corner. Anyway, so the S-Video stuff looks pretty good, but I want you guys to notice I'm actually using a very special brand of S-Video cables, the ones by Monster, so most of them would never look this good. And also, the RGB SCART stuff is a little pink, and I assume this is because it's on a different GameCube, though honestly I'm not sure, but since it's not the point of this video, I didn't really focus on it too much. Now, going between the component 480i 480p and the HDMI 480i 480p, I highly recommend you look around the title cards, around where it says Start and Options and stuff. That's where you'll really notice, like, just with the naked eye, like, what it looks like interlaced versus what it looks like progressive. Progressive stuff looks a lot smoother and a lot cleaner. So the HDMI stuff, 480p, like, this is the best. This is what it's going to look like, and trust me, you'll see more gameplay of it in a little bit here. But right now what I want to do is compare Composite. Now, Composite, of course, the worst one. This is the way that most people are playing the Cube. Versus this is, of course, the HDMI. This is what it can look like. This is the best it's going to get with this modification versus what, well, this is what it looks like without it. And this is going through a FrameMeister. I want you to know that too. Going through a FrameMeister means that it's been cleaning up the composite, S-Video, RGB, and even the component to a certain degree, whereas the HDMI stuff is just the pure straight digital signal. So my point is, your composite wouldn't even look as good as the composite you're seeing in this video, but your HDMI can look even better. Now, because the whole point of this is to compare the HDMI stuff the most, we're just going to rewatch that same scene, HDMI 480i versus 480p. Again, all the 480i HDMI stuff, this is the best your stuff can look if you have PAL versions of games, but if you have the 480p American games, they can look, well, like this. So keep that in mind. It's, you know, I'm sorry, Europe, it's just what happened, but that's another reason I highly recommend you import your games if you have that option. Now, I'm sure there's people who are saying, all right, dude, I have the component 480p cables. How much better does it get? Well, I decided I'd give you a couple of shots, just fire back, rapid fire, just to show you. Really, it does make a pretty significant difference. It is pretty impressive. That said, don't forget that this footage has been captured, it's been edited, it's been exported, it's been processed by YouTube. Point being that the actual 480p HDMI footage will look better on your TV than what you're actually seeing in this video. So the last thing I want to talk about here is the mod itself. Now, if you look here on the back of the console, you'll notice once again that it looks pretty clean, it looks pretty nice. What I really like is the way they actually did the HDMI mod. I mean, look at the location of it. A lot of people do this. This is the mod, you know, kind of sitting externally, and it just looks like really bad in a lot of ways. I just don't like this. Where John and Patrick actually took the time to find extra space so you didn't have to sacrifice the component port, because a lot of people do that. You know, they'll also do this. They'll just cut a hole in it, and I think that looks really tacky. I mean, obviously it's functionally there, but it's not nice. And this is the nicest version I've seen other than what John and Patrick did, which is you remove the component port and you basically use a 3D printer to just kind of fit it in there. And I think that's also not as good, because they left in the, as you can see, all the ports are still there, plus that switch. So you actually have all original functionality plus additional functionality by allowing it to basically split into two monitors if you really want to do that. So again, thank you, John and Patrick. You did a fantastic job. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys check out all their information in the description so you can pick one up as well. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you all later.